What is Henry Kissinger's legacy in the Middle East? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute's interview program. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Bill Quandt. William Quandt twice served on the U.S. National Security Council, first in the Nixon administration from 1972 to 1974, and from 1977 to 1979 in the Carter administration. Quandt was actively involved in the negotiations that led to the 1978 Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel and the 1979 Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty. He is a past president of the Middle East Studies Association, MESA. His numerous publications include Peace Process, American Diplomacy, and the Arab-Israeli Conflict since 1967. Bill Quandt, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Thank you for inviting me.
To start off, within a year of your joining the National Security Council in 1972, Henry Kissinger had become both Nixon's national security advisor and his Secretary of State, and for all intents and purposes had no significant bureaucratic competitors in formulating U.S. foreign policy. In this context, what were his objectives in the Middle East? And did these go beyond superpower rivalry and reducing Soviet influence in the region?
I think to understand Kissinger's approach to the Middle East, you have to realize that he had never spent much time thinking about or writing about the Middle East before he got to government. And when he first was appointed as National Security Advisor by Nixon, Nixon actually told him not to deal with the Middle East. And I think Nixon wasn't quite sure that he was the right man for the job because he didn't know much about it. And I think, quite frankly, Nixon suspected that he was too closely committed to Israel, and Nixon was trying to be a bit more even-handed. So initially, in the first couple of years of the Nixon administration, the State Department did kind of manage foreign policy on the Middle East.
Under William Rogers.
Under William Rogers. Not a terribly effective Secretary of State, but he made an effort to develop a kind of framework in cooperation with the Soviet Union on the framework for an Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement, the so-called Rogers Plan, and something similar on the Jordanian front. He didn't touch the Palestinian issue, but he at least addressed those. Kissinger was profoundly skeptical, partly because it was being done by the State Department, partly because it was being done initially as an attempt at coordination with the Soviet Union. Now, I think it's important to also add that Kissinger approached international relations and foreign policy very much as a product of a European experience and an academic who had written about the conditions under which European security had fallen apart in the 20th century and the creation of a more peaceful 19th century. And that was his intellectual framework, was European state-to-state relations. As when he came of age as an academic in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, his writing shifted more toward the Cold War dynamic with the Soviet Union, the geopolitics of the new power relations that came out of World War II. And the Middle East was not irrelevant to that, but it was on the sidelines, and to some extent through the 1950s and even into the 1960s, it was seen as kind of a British-French sphere of influence, which had to be dealt with through some kind of decolonization and then competition with the Soviet Union. Up until the time Kissinger entered government in 1969, I doubt if he had ever met with or dealt with any senior Arab diplomatic figure. I think it's essentially true that he had had no direct contact. So this was kind of unknown territory for him. The first time he really exerted some influence on American foreign policy toward the Middle East was during the Jordan crisis of 1970.
When it was known as Black September.
Right. And that was partly because there was a real concern at the time when the Syrians sent their troops into northern Jordan that this could escalate. The Israelis
Just to interrupt, to clarify, this was an armed confrontation between Palestinian guerrillas operating under the umbrella of the PLO and the Jordanian military or the Jordanian monarchy. And Syria at one stage intended to send mechanized forces into Jordan in support of the Palestinians.
Right. And there was some concern on the American side that the Israelis would respond by also intervening, and that this could have an effect of really creating a major crisis in the Middle East. So Kissinger, at Nixon's urging, got involved in this. And I think the crisis ended with the Syrian troops withdrawing, King Hussein remaining on the throne. A lot of Palestinians were killed and badly treated. It was a messy period, and the PLO eventually moved its base of operations from Jordan to Lebanon. And that, I think, was an outcome that Kissinger felt was a good outcome, because the Soviet-backed Syrians had not prevailed. The American-oriented King Hussein was still on the throne, and Israel had not directly intervened because the United States had urged it not to, and had tried to coordinate that between Jordan and Israel. So that was his first kind of tactical intervention, where he got involved in the details. But it gave him a greater role, and Nixon, I think, began to look toward him for ideas of what to do with the problems of the Middle East. Now, one last point, Nixon himself had ideas on the Middle East, and they were not exactly the same as Kissinger's, as far as I could tell. I never spent much time around Nixon, but I had read a fair amount of what he had said elsewhere, and I could see that he was more worried that the Arab-Israeli conflict post-1967 was explosive, that it was going to blow up at some point. He used to use the analogy of the Balkans before World War I. In and of itself, it might look like a local conflict, but it had the potential to explode and draw in other powers. And he would frequently urge that we needed to pay more attention to this. Now, the problem for both Nixon and Kissinger, and I don't want to be an apologist for them, but is they inherited a problem that was time-consuming and costly for the United States, and that was the Vietnam War. That wasn't one that they wanted, but they inherited it, and they had to figure out either how to solve it or get out of it or win it. And I think it's pretty clear that Nixon thought it was a losing war. That is, the cost of trying to prevail in Vietnam was too great, but he also wanted to get reelected without looking like he was the first American president to lose a major war. So he was constantly trying to think, as a politician, when should we make our moves to start negotiating on Vietnam? How can we get someone like either the Russians or the Chinese to help us in that endeavor? And the real brilliance of Nixon, in my view, was that he saw the possibility of the opening toward China as a way of first kind of diffusing the risk that Vietnam would become even more explosive, and perhaps get Chinese help on cooling down, getting a negotiation started, and that it would help give him more influence in his relations with Russia. Having the two major communist powers both having good relations with the United States would put the United States in a good position. And that was really more Nixon than Kissinger. Kissinger was the implementer of the policy. And I think it's important to say that he turned out to be very good at that. He wasn't as great at conceptualizing what needed to be done, but when he was given a specific problem, he turned out to be a very good negotiator. That is, his face-to-face relations with Mao Zedong, with Zhou Enlai, with Brezhnev, they turned out to be much more interesting than you would expect a guy whose basic background had been, he was an academic. He'd never done negotiations before. So that's just a quick introduction to how I saw him in my first phase of working for him.
And against this background, did he develop a strategic objective for his dealings with the Middle East, or did he see it simply as you seem to suggest, one more arena for superpower competition?
I arrived just after the very important development. President Sadat of Egypt in July of 1972, just before I joined the NSC staff, had announced that 15,000 Soviet military advisors would be leaving the country. It caught us pretty much by surprise, caught me by surprise. And so one of the first things I tried to do is, when I had access to the materials, I had the clearances that allowed me to read this, the background to this, was to find out, where did this come from? Why did it happen? And what are we doing about it? And although there wasn't much visible reaction, I think Americans were kind of unsure why Sadat had done this. Sadat tended to be viewed as a not very strong or very serious political figure. He had almost lost power in 1971.
And I believe the consensus in Washington was that he wouldn't last very long.
That's right. So we hadn't taken it very seriously.
And maybe if I could just to expand further on this particular point, as you indicated, the same year that you joined National Security Council, Egypt's new president, Anwar Sadat, famously ended his country's alliance with the Soviet Union and expelled the 15,000 military advisors from the country. And it was, I think we can agree, one of the Soviet Union's most important reversals during the Cold War. Yet, and I think you've just confirmed this, it's widely reported that the US under Kissinger had virtually no role in bringing this development about, and additionally failed to exploit it. And you'd started giving us your recollections of this era. I'd be very interested to hear both that, what was actually happening and what Kissinger's role in it was.
I don't know to what extent before Sadat made his decision, there had been any signaling to him that the presence of such a large Soviet military contingent in Egypt was a serious problem for us in terms of bettering our relations. But I have heard, but I don't have firsthand information about this, that at one point Nixon had told the Saudis that if the Egyptians would reduce their dependence on the Soviet Union and get the military advisors to leave, then that would open the way for a different relationship with the United States. And it's possible that the Saudis conveyed that to Sadat, but I have no idea of whether that triggered his decision. In any case, we were more or less caught by surprise. Interestingly, though, the first thing that Nixon and Kissinger did was they opened a direct channel to Sadat through Hafiz Ismail, his national security advisor, which was actually moderately active in the remaining part of 1972, but partly just to kind of fill time. Basically, the American message in this latter part of 1972, directly to Sadat through his advisor, was we can't do much on the Middle East in the remainder of 1972 until the election is over. We're preoccupied with Vietnam. We're involved in an opening toward China. We've got the détente relationship, but the Middle East is the next item on our agenda. But you've got to understand, we have an election to win. And it was just about that explicit. And there was a lot of truth to it. No president wants to go into a re-election campaign with a controversial topic like the Middle East on his agenda. So we basically said to Egypt, give us a little bit of time, but by the end of the year, we will be in a position to take further steps. And I think
the year being 1972.
Yes. And this is what led, by the end of 72, we were talking about a meeting between Nixon and Hafiz Ismail, which I first learned about in probably about December. I was the #2 person in the office, but my boss had worked with Kissinger for some time, and Kissinger called him in and said, I'm going to be meeting next month with Hafiz Ismail. I want you guys to get me prepared for it. And we had already been working on a briefing book for him, and we had about 200 pages of it already written. So we wrote the cover memo, and Kissinger had a remarkable skill for absorbing information very quickly, even about topics that he didn't have much background on. So he prepared himself for this meeting. He met Hafiz Ismail, I think, in January of 1973. And I think for a first meeting, it was a step in the right direction. The human chemistry was good. I think Hafiz Ismail was a very sophisticated diplomat, but Kissinger's view was, this is the first step, but we still need some time. We've got all these other issues on the agenda. Vietnam is still not yet off the table. We're close, but we're not yet there. So I need to string them along for a little bit longer. I understand it's frustrating for Sadat, but what's he going to do? He's not going to go to war because he'll be defeated again, just as he was in 1967. So that was his basic attitude. Mm-hmm. Middle East is important. Nixon wants me to do something, but maybe by the end of the year, we'll be ready to turn our attention to it.
That year now being 1973. And the key issue for Egypt, of course, was a recovery of the Sinai Peninsula, which it had lost to Israel in the 1967 war. And in the context of what we were just discussing, we then, of course, have the most significant event in the Middle East during Kissinger's tenure, I think it's fair to say. And that was the 1973 October War. Kissinger was famously blindsided by the joint Egyptian-Syrian military assault to recover their territories that had been occupied by Israel in 1967. Why do you think this was so?
I would say there are 3 points to bear in mind. The first I've alluded to, that Kissinger, as a kind of realist, thought that countries don't go to war if they think they're going to be defeated. And that based on what had happened in 1967, the prospects for Egypt and Syria were not very good. Secondly, I think it's also true that the Egyptians and to some extent the Syrians were quite good at engaging in kind of deception operations. There was a false alert in the spring where the Egyptians spring of 73, where the Egyptians did very much the same thing that they later did in September and October. They began to mobilize, they had exercises, they went on a high alert. This time the Israelis took it seriously and went on an alert themselves, and the whole thing then just wound down. So that was, when we saw it again in the fall, this was the first time I'd really focused on a crisis happening on my watch, and I thought it looked pretty realistic. I mean, they were doing things that I thought, this doesn't look like a normal exercise. They were emptying out hospitals. They were doing, we had a lot of information, but people had seen this over and over again in the preceding years.
So it was the boy who cried wolf was the assumption.
Kissinger, however, did in September, the month before the war began, he said, I think maybe we need to start paying more attention. And he put out an order to go on a full-scale intelligence collection alert. And our information started coming in huge quantities. So he wasn't totally blindsided. Among other things, the Soviet leader had met with Nixon in June. And in one of his moments of real candor, he said, you know, if we don't do something about the Middle East, there's going to be a war by the end of the year. The Egyptians and the Syrians are not going to wait. And they took it somewhat seriously, but they didn't, again.
They being the Americans or the Soviets?
The Americans took the warning seriously. That's what led to this higher collection of intelligence. But they also thought it was the Russians bluffing, wanting us to then put pressure on the Israelis and so forth.
Because it was also known that the Soviets had advised the Egyptians and the Syrians against
I think
this attack.
I think that's probably true, because they also thought they would probably lose and lose fairly dramatically. The third issue. And at the time, I didn't really know this, but now I think we have pretty good evidence. The Israelis had a source in the Egyptian government.
This is a late President Nasser's son-in-law,
Ashraf.
Ashraf Marwan.
Ashraf Marwan, very unusual, and it's still somewhat controversial as to whether he really was working for the Israelis or for the Egyptians.
Or both.
Or both. He was a complicated character. But the Israelis who believed in him thought if there's going to be a war, he's going to know about it and he'll tell us. He has given us so much information. So if he says it's going to happen, we'll take it seriously. Well, I can tell you when they heard from him that it was going to happen. That was October 5th.
They ignored him.
On the 6th. No, they took it seriously on the 5th when they finally heard it. And that's when they called us and said, the war is going to start tomorrow. And I, by chance, was the first one on the American side, on the policy side, to get that message. So I remember it very vividly. They finally said, we've been wrong. It's going to start tomorrow. They didn't quite get the time right, but they knew it was going to happen. But that was the other reason. In some sense, we said, if the Israelis don't think it's going to happen, they probably have better sources than we do. So why should we worry more than they do?
As the war progressed, there have been persistent reports that Israeli leaders were in a panic at the initial Arab advances, and at one point put the country's nuclear forces on standby or revealed them to American satellites to encourage the US to expand and accelerate its military resupply effort. What is your own recollection of these developments?
Well, in the first 2 or 3 days, I think it is true that the Israelis were sort of stunned by how quickly the advances were made on the Syrian and the Egyptian front.
Because Egypt had crossed the Suez Canal and demolished what was thought to be the impregnable Bar-Lev line fortifications.
Right. But then they stopped, and their forces were protected from aerial attack because they had air defense.
Egyptian forces.
Egyptian air front.
Yes.
And on the Syrian front, the Syrians simply launched an all-out, straightforward attack, and they did pretty well for about 2 days. So in that brief period, I think the one person on the Israeli side who really panicked was Moshe Dayan, who was the Minister of Defense.
Minister of Defense.
And he sought a meeting, as we now know, I didn't know this at the time, with Golda Meir to at least review the possibility of doing what you said, putting the nuclear forces on some kind of an alert that people would notice, or perhaps some people have even said, considering a demonstrative test of a weapon maybe in the Sinai somewhere, just to remind everybody that we have these things. Now, what I know now, at least I think I know now, is that Golda Meir said we're not going to talk about that, but she did send her ambassador to see Kissinger and say we need urgent resupply of military equipment, partly because we're going to be using a lot, and partly because it will signal American support for us. And we need, for our people to know that you're behind us. And she basically said, and I will come if necessary and lobby Congress for this. And he said, that's a terrible idea. It looks like you're panicking. Don't even think of leaving in the midst of the war, but we'll start addressing the issue. Now, at about this time, and I think I'm the only person who remembers this on the American side, not that there are many left who are alive today. Kissinger and I are the only two participants on the American side still around. But I remember getting a piece of intelligence, just a very standard report of electronic monitoring of military facilities in the Middle East. And it said that the Israeli missile, the so-called Jericho missile facilities had been put on a higher level of alert, period. That's all we knew. Didn't say what.
And the Jericho is an Israeli ballistic missile.
It was a ballistic missile that, as far as we knew, well, we didn't know what kind of warhead it would carry, but it wasn't a very accurate missile. So you're not going to use their Air Force was, by contrast, a very effective Air Force. The only reason you would perhaps have a missile is if you were going to put a nuclear weapon on it. But we didn't know that. So the missile alert got my attention. I reported it to Kissinger and Nixon. It was never discussed. I never heard any discussion, and I was in almost all the policy deliberations about Israel and its nuclear potential. But I'm sure that if we picked up this signal, the Russians had picked it up, and the Egyptians had picked it up. Now, well after the war and after Egypt had already made peace, Sadat was asked by an Israeli general where they met at some point. He said, why didn't you advance on the second and third day after you'd crossed the canal when we were in no position to stop you at that point? And Sadat, in his sort of unusual way, broke into laughter. He said, oh, haven't you heard Israel had nuclear weapons? So it may have been on his mind, but we actually didn't need to be reminded of it by the alert of the Jericho missiles. But that has stuck in my mind. I still remember it. No one else on the American side has confirmed it. We've never found, people have looked for the report. I'm sure in some dusty file it still exists, but anyway, that's the closest I got to sensing that there was a nuclear dimension in that early period.
There was also another nuclear dimension that's been discussed, and that as the war progressed and the superpowers themselves became increasingly involved, US-Soviet tensions escalated markedly. Moscow at one point threatened direct intervention to enforce a cessation of hostilities, particularly as Israel was surrounding the Egyptian Third Army. And Washington responded by raising its nuclear alert level to keep the Soviets out. How close did we come to a direct confrontation between the superpowers in October 1973? And what was Kissinger's role in these events?
Well, just the quick version is that by about the 18th or 19th of October,
the war erupted on the 6th of October,
right.
and ended, I
So
think,
about 2 weeks into the war, there was a kind of strategic breakthrough on the Israeli side. They managed to cross the Suez Canal, and they were in the process of trying to envelop the second and third Egyptian armies, that is to cut them off from behind.
We were both at this stage in the Sinai Peninsula.
Mm-hmm. And I think this was a point when the Russians began to worry that the Egyptians might really get crushed and started pushing them hard for a ceasefire. And Sadat finally began to say, maybe we've done this, gone as far as we can. And he gave them the green light to negotiate a ceasefire. So Kissinger went to Moscow on about the 20th or 21st of October. On the 22nd of October, they reached agreement on submitting a resolution to the UN Security Council, which called for an immediate ceasefire in place. And the parties were supposed to stop at that point. And Kissinger then flew to Israel to explain to the Israelis that the ceasefire was supposed to go into effect in 12 hours or something, that he had negotiated this, and the ceasefire was going to go into effect. And the Israelis complained. They said, we need a little bit more time. We almost have completed our military operation of surrounding the Egyptians, but we need a little bit more time, and you should have consulted us before you did this. And they made him feel very much as if he should have consulted them. And they played on his sense of, guilt about, not being strong enough supporter of Israel. So he said, look, I'm flying back to the United States. If anything happens while I'm in the air, I can't do much about it anyway. But by the time I get back, this has to be wrapped up. So the Israelis took that as a green light to just accelerate their actions on the ground for the next 12 hours, which they did, to the great anger of the Russians and the Egyptians, who felt that it was kind of breaking the we'd agreed on this ceasefire, and all of a sudden it was being violated. So by the time Kissinger returned to the United States on the 23rd, 24th, cables were going back and forth between Moscow and Washington, the Russians saying, you promised that the ceasefire would go into effect. The Israelis seem to be breaking it. We need to, we'll work on the Egyptian side to get them to calm down. You work on the Israeli side. And at the end of a long day on the 24th, Brezhnev, in his own handwriting, added to one of the messages being sent. He said, and if you don't join us in a joint initiative to end the violations of the ceasefire, we will consider taking all means, including military, to enforce the ceasefire. So that was the closest the Russians had come to threatening a direct military intervention. We didn't know whether they were serious about it. We knew they had the capability for it. They had the 3 airborne divisions on high alert. All of their aircraft that had been performing resupply operations had been brought back to the Soviet Union. So,
and they had ships in the Mediterranean.
They had ships in the Mediterranean. So it wasn't out of the question that they could send, 10,000 people as peacekeepers to try to enforce the ceasefire. Now, the other thing that has to be remembered is that at this point, Nixon was in terrible shape politically. His vice president had just resigned over a scandal. The Watergate crisis was in full bloom. His taped recordings were being looked at and investigated. He was in terrible shape and probably not functioning at his normally reasonably competent level.
So he was effectively out of commission.
Well, I saw him once or twice during this period. He could pull off he could still function, but he was under huge pressure. And the night that the decision was made to go on to a higher level of, there are several stages of nuclear alert or military readiness. We went to a stage 3 worldwide readiness level on the night of October 24th. Nixon was not at the meeting when that decision was made. It is widely believed, and I think it's true, that he had had too much to drink that night. And no one wanted him to be consulted because he might have, who knows, done what.
One wouldn't know the results.
So the decision was made by a small group of the National Security Council. I was not at the meeting, but it was Kissinger and Schlesinger, and there was no vice president at this time. So it was just the head of CIA and so forth. And they said, we'll announce the higher level of alert, but let's try to keep it secret, secret from the American public. Well, of course, you can't do that because the alert meant that every reserve unit in the United States was called up for active duty. Report to your bases, get ready if you're a pilot to get into B-52 and start getting ready for operations. It's not like the next step up is get ready to go to war. This is kind of get your forces prepared for the possibility. I think, but I can't prove this, that it was a deliberate overreaction. He wanted to make sure that the Russians had no illusions that if they went in, we would take some kind of counteraction somewhere. And at one point, the next morning, we had a brief moment when we thought that the Russians were in fact sending troops into Egypt. We had gotten a fragment of intelligence that suggested that. It turned out to be something else. But at that point, Kissinger turned to me and to one person from the State Department and said, they're going in. We have to send troops as well. Figure out where in the Middle East or in the region we could send our troops. Well, it went through my mind quickly, bases in Cyprus, in Turkey, Diego Garcia, no place else. The Europeans wouldn't let us. And none of these were plausible. And I thought, this is ridiculous. There's just no there's no place to go. He said, but not Israel and not Egypt. We don't want to make this into a war over, if this is about US, Soviet intervention in the Middle East, we have to have troops somewhere so that we can negotiate our way out with them. Anyway, within 30 minutes, he came back and said, forget about it. I've just talked to Dobrynin. This is all a misunderstanding. They're sending 30.
Dobrynin being the Soviet ambassador.
Soviet ambassador in Washington, who had a very good relationship with Kissinger. They talked all the time. He said, I had forgotten that when I was in Moscow a few days ago, we had agreed that they would send 30 observers for the ceasefire, and we would send 30 just to monitor it. Not combat forces, but just military professionals who would monitor it. And we had picked up the news that that group was on its way to Moscow, and we interpreted that as a military deployment. So it ended very quickly, and I still remember that in the kind of as it ended and the fighting on the ground stopped, Kissinger brought us all together, and he said, "I think we've gotten through the worst of it. I think the ceasefire is now going to hold. What we now need to do is make sure we get the diplomacy started so that it doesn't unravel." And he said, "I think we've ended up," and he used an expression which I, as a native English speaker, didn't know. He said, "We're in the catbird seat." It means we're in the best position we could be in, because the Israelis need us, the Egyptians want us, the Russians have been dealing with us, but they've kind of backed down. And he said, now is the time for the diplomacy. And I think my first move is to go to Egypt. He had never been to Egypt. He'd never met Sadat. And the big transformation in his view, and he writes about this in his memoirs, is he'd always treated Sadat as a buffoon, kind of a, not a serious person. He said within about 30 minutes of talking with him, he realized that this guy is thinking on a much bigger scale than he had ever realized, and not quibbling over little details, but saying, this is what we have in mind. And he all of a sudden started taking Sadat much, much more seriously. And that's why the initial emphasis was very quickly on, let's consolidate this relationship. And if they really shift their relationship from heavy dependence on the Soviet Union to a new relationship with the United States, that's important. And this is, of course, Kissinger in his Cold War mode and his geostrategic way of thinking. And so he took the Egyptian opening very seriously. He didn't take Saudi Arabia or Syria nearly as seriously until he met Assad, the other Arab leader that he ended up having quite a bit of respect for. And he spent a lot of time with him. He spent at least as much time with Assad as he did with Sadat, because Assad was a much tougher negotiator. And he came away thinking, this guy is actually very smart. He's very shrewd. And he's a very good negotiator. So he began to see Arabs as human beings. And he had remarkably good relations with, particularly, I think, Sadat and Assad, never with Faisal. Saudi King Faisal was kind of edgy about his Jewishness, and he would talk about the Jewish conspiracy. And Kissinger would sit there and try to be polite, but he just never felt comfortable with the Saudis. But King Hussein he got along with. Surprisingly, he got along quite well with Houari Boumediene, the president of Algeria. There were certain Arab leaders that he really kind of developed a respect for. That did not, of course, include any of the Palestinian leaders, because he didn't meet with them.
No. But speaking of Saudi Arabia and King Faisal, how did Kissinger respond to the Arab oil boycott announced in response to the U.S. U.S. support of the Israeli war effort in 1973? And are reports that he threatened Saudi Arabia with military intervention to end the boycott credible?
I think that Kissinger was no smarter about the international economics of petroleum than most political scientists or historians would be. He didn't understand very much the economics of international oil. So when people say that there might be a cutback in oil production or a boycott, somebody else would say, yeah, look, the Arabs can't drink their oil, they've got to sell it. They threatened to use the oil weapon in 1956, it never happened. They threatened it in 1967, it never happened. So don't worry too much. There's plenty of oil somewhere in the world. So
a bit like the false alarm in early 73.
Right. But this time, the more intelligent people who knew about the international oil market said, in every previous crisis, there has been a lot of spare capacity somewhere, Venezuela or Mexico, or, and that is no longer the case. The only spare capacity anywhere in the world is Saudi Arabia. And if they really began to cut production, it's going to have an effect on the world market. And that will include the United States. So in the middle of the crisis, and after the war had begun, we started monitoring the possibility that the oil weapon would be activated by the Arab side. And it didn't happen. On October 15th, 4 Arab foreign ministers came to see Nixon to protest basically our resupply of Israelis military with weapons. They were actually very polite in their protests, but they didn't say anything about oil. And I remember as they walked out, Kissinger said, that went pretty well. There was no threat of an oil embargo. And the next day they announced it. So yes, it became an issue.
This is on the 10th day of the war, more or less.
Yes. It became an issue, and it became a big issue because it affected domestic politics in the United States. I mean, I lived through it. We had oil lines. You'd have to wait for an hour to fill up your tank with gas. Price quadrupled by the end of the year. So for the average American, the Middle East crisis came home in the form of the domestic effect on the American economy. But worldwide, everybody was being affected by it. So Kissinger went through a period when he said, if the Arabs want me to play a role in negotiating these disengagement agreements or peace agreements or whatever it is, I will not do it under the pressure of the oil embargo. So they have to start loosening up for me to be expected to play any diplomatic role. And it was a kind of cat and mouse game. He would say, I'm not going to do this anymore unless you start resuming production. And they never ended the oil embargo, and they didn't resume production until after the Syrian-Israeli disengagement agreement. So he constantly protested that he wasn't going to negotiate under the threat of the oil embargo, and yet he did it.
And the disengagement agreement was the following year, if I'm not mistaken. It
was the spring of 1974 that he first got an Egyptian-Israeli disengagement agreement in January, and then in May he got the Syrian-Israeli one. All during that time, the oil crisis was going on. The domestic politics of that was convincing people that this was an important diplomatic initiative that, if it succeeded, it would make their economic difficulties a little less difficult.
Many analysts view please go ahead.
Asked about whether there was any threat to seize the oil fields. I am not aware of any such. I never heard any such thing. I know that there were people in the public arena who were close to people in the Pentagon. A guy named Edward Luttwak, who was also very close to the Israelis, wrote an article in either the Atlantic or someplace about it would be easy to go in and seize the Saudi oil fields. That would solve the crisis. And it got a lot of attention. I'm not aware that anybody on the American side took that seriously. Of course, it could have been done, but it was simply not something.
It wasn't on the agenda.
It wasn't on the agenda.
Even as a threat.
I don't think it was ever made as a threat. The Saudis had to understand that there was a point at which, they probably would damage their relationship with the United States. But the United States wasn't, I think, at any point planning to use its own military power to seize the oil fields.
So many analysts view the 1973 October War, which we've been discussing, as a seismic political event that at the same time produced a genuine opportunity for a comprehensive Arab-Israeli peace. Many also conclude that the opportunity was squandered on account of Kissinger's prioritization of Egyptian-Israeli and Syrian-Israeli disengagement, which you just mentioned, what was known as step-by-step diplomacy, as well as his commitment to Israel not to engage with the PLO and effectively shelve the Palestine question.
Right.
It's also asserted that these policies ultimately led Egypt, Sadat, to make a separate peace with Israel, thus enabling Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon, the continuous expansion of Israeli settlement activity in the occupied territories, and ultimately the realities that confront us today. How would you assess the position that Kissinger and his policies bear significant responsibility for the current state of affairs in Israel-Palestine?
Well, I think there's a long story that would put all the pieces together, and you could probably make the case that had Kissinger played his hand a little bit differently, it might have slightly improved the odds of getting a broader Arab-Israeli peace agreement. But I think and I don't want to sound like an apologist for this, because I also worked for an administration that more genuinely did try for a comprehensive peace. That is the Carter administration. But I think starting with Egypt and Syria as the first two components of a new strategy for dealing with the Arab-Israeli conflict was normal. They were the combatants in a fairly serious war, and something had to be done to stabilize each of those fronts. So step by step you had to somehow get started. You couldn't have simply said, let's go from this big war and let's have a big conference and settle everything overnight. It just wasn't going to realistically work. Among other things, the Israelis were facing an election. They weren't in any position to make huge decisions on what came to be known as final status issues. So I think probably anybody in Kissinger's position would have said, let's start with something that at least diffuses the immediate risk of a resumption of hostilities, gets the parties talking in some kind of indirect or direct mode, and gives us a little bit of time to develop the next step after. Well, by the time that came, Nixon was no longer president. He had been forced out in the middle of 1974. So you had a new president on the American side who, new presidents take time to get their own head around their priorities. And then he had to face election in 1976. So I think the step-by-step was a way of getting diplomatic process started, but it reached a dead end by 1975. Even Kissinger knew that it had reached a dead end by then. And I'm not sure what he would have done if he had continued as Secretary of State under a re-elected or an elected President Ford. He certainly would not have been able to just take another little slice of Sinai or a little slice of Golan. He would have had to confront the Jordanian-Palestinian front. Now, he personally was allergic to dealing with the Palestinians as a state-like entity. Remember, he's a realist. He thinks of states, not political movements. He did explore briefly the possibility of a Jordanian-Israeli small step to complement the ones that had been done.
This is post-73.
This would have been in 1974. And there were brief discussions about it, but there was no overlap in what Jordan wanted and what the Israelis would agree to. And so he spent a little bit of time on it and then just said, it's not going to work. It's not going to work in this moment. So he went for a second disengagement on the Egyptian front in order to kind of consolidate that relationship. And that, I think, tells you that his main strategic objective was to bring Egypt into the American camp, try to solidify that, and then see where things stood in 1976, 77.
And if I understand you correctly, making commitments to Israel that the US would have no dealings with the PLO came quite easy to him in the context of bartering that with the Israelis, if you will, in order to get the second Sinai disengagement deal.
Yes, I think it was a mistake to give them that commitment. If you read the commitment very carefully, it doesn't exclude any form of contacts. We had a so-called security channel with the PLO through all of this in Beirut. It's true, we rarely used it for any serious diplomatic exchanges, but if necessary, it could be used. What he said, we will not negotiate with or recognize, was the language that he used. Well, you can do other things than negotiate. Kissinger never would have felt bound by his own language. The problem was Congress took that language and codified it into law and said that no American official may have any contacts with a member of with the leadership of the PLO, making it even worse than what he had promised. So by the time I was in government, I had been dealing with PLO people for the previous 7 or 8 years. I was probably one of the leading so-called specialists on the Palestinian issue. I couldn't talk to any of my PLO contacts not because of Kissinger's promise, but because of legislation that had been passed making that illegal, except for the security channel through the CIA. That was the only channel. Now, despite that, we were able to communicate with the PLO in the Carter administration through private Americans, through other Arab governments, which usually was not a good idea because each Arab government put its own spin on the relationship or what Arafat meant. So I think we paid a price for not having the ability to have a normal diplomatic channel to the PLO leadership in this kind of period when the United States had, under Carter, not under Kissinger and Nixon and Ford, started to recognize that the Palestinian issue had to be on the diplomatic agenda. The way it got on the agenda for Carter was to say that the Palestinians should have a homeland of their own. Didn't quite say state, but it's closer than any previous formulation. And it caught people's attention, and it caused Carter some political problems too. But he never backed away from it. He simply said, now we have to figure out how to fold them in. And that's a question of, can the PLO bring itself to accept UN Resolution 242, which would open the door for us to deal with them directly? Or if they can't do that, is there some other formulation that we can agree on that would open the door? And I have to say, as one who tried quite hard to get this to happen in 1977, Arafat told us, I can't accept 242 as it exists. And it's partly because it doesn't even mention us. But we said, you can say that's the reason you don't accept all of it, but what you need to accept is the fundamentals. You accept the concept of living in peace with other states in the region. And he said he was in Lebanon at the time, and the Syrians were very much on his back. And he said, the Syrians will not let me do this. They want to negotiate on our behalf with the United States. They see the Palestinian card as theirs to play. And so that's the excuse he gave to us. He said, if I could do it, I would, but I can't.
And the irony, of course, is that the United States,
10 years later, he did it.
That and the US ultimately recognized the PLO only after the Israelis did. I'd now like to turn to a different issue in the region, and that concerns Iraq and Iraqi Kurds. In 1972, Kissinger, apparently throwing the CIA's caution on the matter to the wind, engineered a shift in US policy towards Iraq, whose Ba'athist government had drawn increasingly close to the Soviet Union. Washington that year joined Israel and the Shah of Iran, who were both intent on weakening Baghdad in providing direct military support to the country's Kurdish guerrilla movements. As was suggested by Kissinger at the time, the purpose of such assistance was not to enable the achievement of Kurdish aspirations, but rather to foment a Kurdish insurrection and destabilize the Iraqi government. When the Shah of Iran and Iraq, Saddam Hussein, in 1975 signed an agreement in Algiers that obliged Iran to cease arming Iraq's Kurds, the US quickly followed suit, and the Kurdish rebellion collapsed and was crushed by the Iraqi military.
Right.
Testifying before Congress about the episode, Kissinger famously remarked that, and I quote, "covert action should not be confused with missionary work," end quote. With that lengthy introduction, what are your recollections of this episode? And would it be fair to say that such cynicism and disregard for the human consequences of political decisions was a hallmark of Kissinger's approach to the Middle East?
I don't know all the details on this, partly because Iran, even though the office I was in was relatively small, and Iran was not a topic that I dealt with primarily. So my impression is that in this period of 1972, 73, 74, the United States was counting quite heavily on Iran as one of the kind of regional pillars of stability. Kind of ironic, given what happened to the Shah. This was the so-called Nixon doctrine. As we got out of Vietnam, we were looking for pillars of stability elsewhere. So it was the Shah of Iran who really wanted the Kurdish issue to be heated up so that he could deal with Saddam Hussein more readily. And I think that that's the instigation for it. I don't think that Kissinger cared one way or the other about the Kurds per se, or the Kurdish national aspirations, or Kurds as a tool of diplomacy. But I think because the Shah wanted it, we went along with it and facilitated. And the Israelis, the Shah and the Israelis were kind of a potent behind-the-scenes lobby for policy on an issue of this sort. It also, I think, as you imply, is kind of a cynical manipulation of local conflicts in order to advance perhaps an illusory strategic objective. It's not unusual in politics for politicians to do that. As Kissinger said, or said that, it's not missionary work that we're engaged in. It is, power balances and things like that. So yes, I think that he was not particularly sensitive to what we would now think of as a human rights agenda. It's not a concept that came naturally to him or to Nixon or any of the others who were forged in this kind of post-Cold War or Cold War mentality, where the big stakes were nuclear war, and there were lots of problems in the world that needed attention, but it wasn't for the foreign policy strategists to spend a lot of time thinking about them. And of course, that changed significantly with Carter. I'm not saying that he was a perfect exemplar of a more human rights oriented foreign policy, but at least he took it into account. And there was nothing, I can say this honestly, in the 2.5 years that I worked for Carter, I was never aware of anything comparable to what we did with the Kurds in the Nixon, Ford, Kissinger period. That is, arming a dissident group in order to destabilize a government. There were some minor little issues in South Yemen, some little issues in Lebanon, but honestly, I would have resigned if it had been a big deal. If we were trying to undermine some government by doing something grossly inappropriate. Carter had a pretty high standard for not, using those kinds of techniques. So yes, Kissinger was a different school. He did not put, and still to this day would not put human rights near the top of the foreign policy agenda. So what can I say? That's who he was.
You've mentioned the Carter administration, and after a hiatus from U.S. government service, as you mentioned, you also served in Carter's National Security Council. How would you compare Kissinger and Carter's National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brezinsski, and what were the most important differences in their approaches to the Middle East?
Well, interestingly, they were both European immigrants to the United States. They both still spoke with a bit of an accent from their countries of origin. They both knew European politics and history and the Soviet Union as their foundational, reference point for foreign policy. And they were rivals in the academic world. They had both sought the same chair at Harvard, and Kissinger got it, and Brzezinski went to Columbia. So there was a lot of similarity. They were both high IQ, very smart, very quick learners. There was a significant difference, though. Kissinger, I think his big development beyond Europe and the US-Soviet Cold War was the opening toward China, which he bore a significant responsibility for. He didn't have that much interest in places like South America, Africa, South Asia, not very much. Brzezinski, by contrast, had concluded that part of the Cold War competition with the Soviet Union was playing out in these other areas, and that he needed to get to know more about them. So during a period of his apprenticeship, he was part of something called the Trilateral Commission, and he did quite a bit of traveling to Asia, to South Asia, to Africa, and did some writing about it. So he had started getting involved in issues that were more on the periphery of the US-Soviet competition, but got kind of interested in those issues. So by the time I got to know him, he was interested in the Middle East. He was involved in the so-called Brookings Study Group, which was on what the policy of the United States should be in 1975, 76, 77. And he had ideas already. He'd been thinking about them.
So it wasn't thrust upon him by
events.
No.
And he had written about Africa and the need for the United States to take Africa more seriously. So he had kind of broadened himself out. And I found that on the Middle East, he had a kind of interest, as I did, in Algeria's experience of decolonization and the 7-year-long war of independence from France. And he, on one occasion, was asked to visit Algeria and asked where he would like to go apart from the formal meetings. And he had read enough about Algeria to know that there was a place in the remote countryside where a meeting had taken place, which was decisive for the Algerian Revolution. He said, "That's where I want to go." And that his level of granular knowledge of that case, and I think a little bit like me, he saw that the Algerian case and the Palestinian case were rather similar, and that the PLO was kind of a model to some extent on the Algerian FLN as a armed, but essentially politically motivated liberation movement. And therefore, we had some capacity for understanding that it wasn't just a bunch of terrorists. These were people with legitimate national aspirations who, in desperation, were taking up arms for their cause, not because they expected that they could win on the battlefield, but that this was their way of getting into the eventual negotiations that would give them a chance to have self-determination. And that would not have been a natural way of thinking for Kissinger. Whereas
to put it mildly,
for Brzezinski, it fit into this mode of trying to understand the post-colonial world so that we could compete more effectively with our strategic rivals, whether they were Russia in the old days, maybe China today. You needed to have some understanding of nationalism, of people wanting to determine their own future.
Um, for my final question, I'd like to also ask you about a different aspect of the Carter administration. So former President Carter, as you yourself has mentioned, and as also reported by many others who've studied his Middle East policy, his initial intention was to produce a comprehensive Arab-Israeli peace, including a resolution of the Palestinian question. Ultimately, he had to settle for a separate Egyptian-Israeli deal that was, for all intents and purposes, implemented at the expense of the Palestinians. To what extent would it be fair to say that Carter's ambitions were frustrated by policies that were put into place by Kissinger? And should we see this as Kissinger's legacy in the Middle East?
I think it's a little bit overly deterministic. I mean, Carter had a chance to break the mold to some extent and to try a more comprehensive approach, which he did for the first several months. I think what stymied Carter was not the legacy of Kissinger, but was the advent of Menachem Begin as Prime Minister of Israel. We had been used to dealing with a bunch of tough Israeli political figures, but they were all from the Labor Party, which fundamentally accepted the idea that they would be satisfied with less than all of historic Palestine as the Jewish state. And that more or less the 1967 lines would, as called for in UN Resolution 242, could be the future borders with Syria, with Egypt, with Jordan, if the security conditions could be met. That was not the view of Menachem Begin or the Likud party. They viewed the 1967 lines, especially in the West Bank, as having no legitimacy. They were armistice lines, they were not borders. And Begin never wavered on that. And we never could figure out a way to get him to change his views on it. So I think that was bad luck in some sense. He got elected because Rabin screwed up and his wife had a bank account that was illegal in Washington, and he was forced to step down as prime minister just as Carter was trying to get the comprehensive peace going. The one time while Rabin was prime minister that he met with Carter really pressed him on how he envisaged the future of the West Bank. And he said, I can't tell you everything I have in mind now because I'm coming up for re-election. But I can tell you my only interest in the West Bank is security, not the borders. They can have the 1967 borders. He didn't talk about East Jerusalem. He said, all we need is reassurance on our security. And that's all I can tell you now. Let me get through the election and we can then deal with Jordan, with the Palestinians. We had asked him about whether he would deal with the PLO. And he said, if the PLO were to accept 242, it would no longer be, in our view, the PLO anymore. So that's why we initially thought maybe this attempt at a comprehensive settlement will go somewhere. By the end of 1973, it was pretty clear that Begin was there to stay.
77.
77, that he was, pretty hard for us to deal with. And Carter had gotten the first big domestic backlash from the American Jewish community when he had tried to call for a conference with the Soviet Union in Geneva by the end of the year. And this was the one time when Kissinger's kind of trying to ease the Soviet Union out of center stage in the Middle East was kind of brought back into the debate. And Carter's bringing the Russians back into the Middle East. And all of the Republicans and Kissinger supporters said, oh, Carter's so naive and he's ruining everything that Kissinger achieved. And Carter really did sort of begin to think that politically he had to slow down a little bit and not rush forward. And in the meantime, Sadat was getting very frustrated. And what we probably had not sufficiently appreciated is he only accepted that is, Sadat only accepted the idea of going to a Geneva conference once everything had already been worked out in advance, because he didn't fundamentally want to be negotiating with Sadat and Assad and King Hussein and Arafat all in the same room together. He wanted to make his deal on his terms and then make them make their deals, and then go to Geneva and sign it all and make it nice, put it in a nice package. So when he went to Jerusalem, which was not our idea, this was Sadat's idea. It was his way of saying, I'm going to break the logjam. I'm going off on my own. And from that time on, in my mind, I thought, this idea that all of the Arab parties are going to move in lockstep toward a comprehensive peace is probably not realistic. Sadat's going to go first. He's in a hurry. He wants to see some tangible results. He wants his territory back.
And he was facing a severe domestic crisis.
He had a domestic problem, and he deeply distrusts Assad. And amazingly, they started the 1973 war exactly on the same day, on the same hour, but that was the last moment of close coordination. And they both thought that the other had betrayed one another during the war. Sadat was supposed to keep the momentum going so that the Israelis could not divert all their attention to the Syrian front. The whole relationship was much more complex than we had realized. And so I think that Carter did the best he could in the political circumstances he found himself in. And of course, the big unknown is, would he, given his kind of early interest in a more comprehensive approach to Middle East peacemaking, would he have gone back to that in a second term? There's no way of answering it.
Yeah.
He didn't have the second term. All I can say is he's the only former president who showed any interest in the Middle East after he left office. He wrote books about it. He met with Arafat. He wrote articles. He came to accept the idea of a Palestinian state. And, you know, he's clinging on to life as we speak. But no one else has shown the degree of serious interest in the Middle East. And it probably has something to do with his own religious background. This is not just any old piece of territory. This for him mattered. And I think had he been able to preside over an Arab-Israeli comprehensive peace, it would have been the crowning victory of his presidency, but he wasn't able to. So, you know, politics is the art of the possible, and it's an excuse, but it's also a reality.
Bill Quandt, thank you very much for sharing your expertise and insights with Connections. It's been a fascinating discussion.
Thank you for inviting me, and I've enjoyed reconnecting with you, and it was indeed interesting.
Thank you.